A woman's near-death experience has shaken everything we think we know. After crossing over, she claims to have encountered Jesus himself, and what he revealed to her is nothing short of terrifying. The truth about the Antichrist, according to her, is darker and more imminent than anyone could have imagined. What did she see, and why was this message given to her?
Isabella Greenfield never imagined her story would end at 38. She often described her life in suburban Illinois as ordinary, but those who knew her would say it had its own quiet charm. Her neighborhood was classic Midwest, a place where seasons felt alive. Summers clung to you with their heat and humidity, while winters blanketed the town in a quiet, almost magical stillness, only disturbed by the rumble of snowplows cutting through icy streets. She lived in a modest but cozy home with her husband Daniel and their 2 kids, Emma and Liam. Daniel was the steady force in her life, hardworking, endlessly supportive, and dependable in a way that sometimes made her feel unworthy. Her kids, they were the heartbeat of her world. 10-year-old Emma had a thoughtful and creative spirit, always finding beauty in the little things, while 6-year-old Liam brought an infectious energy to the family, turning even mundane moments into grand adventures. By profession, Isabella was a middle school teacher, a role that demanded patience in quantities most couldn't imagine. But it was a labor of love. She often spoke about the joy of seeing her students wrestle with new ideas, the light in their eyes when they finally got it. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it gave her a sense of being part of something bigger than herself, even if the results weren't always immediate. When it came to faith, Isabella's relationship with spirituality was nuanced. Her upbringing wasn't exactly steeped in religion. Sure, her parents believed in God, but their church attendance was reserved for milestones, weddings, funerals, and maybe the occasional Christmas service. As an adult, she navigated her spiritual life in her own way. She prayed when life felt heavy, whispered her thanks during the good times, and lived in that hazy space between belief and doubt. It wasn't something she clung to or deeply explored, but it was there, a quiet presence in the background of her life. And yet, it was that ordinary, relatable existence that made her story so extraordinary. Why? Well, how does a life so grounded take such a shocking turn? Isabella's life moved to a steady suburban rhythm, a rhythm that many would call predictable, but one she had grown comfortable with. Her days were packed with the usual: teaching, family dinners, lesson plans, and the endless loop of laundry and dishes. Life had its routines, and in those routines, she found a certain kind of peace. Weekdays felt like a whirlwind, early mornings that blurred into late nights. Between helping Emma tackle her homework and finding ways to keep Liam entertained long enough to throw dinner together, there was little time for anything else. Weekends were a reprieve, filled with soccer games, park trips, and the rare luxury of extra sleep. It wasn't picture perfect, but it was home, and she was content with that. But now, looking back, she realized how much of it she had taken for granted. It's funny how the most ordinary moments only reveal their worth when they're gone, or when life throws something extraordinary your way that changes everything. She'd thought she had it all figured out, her role in the world, her place in the grand scheme of things. But had she? The truth was, Isabella had been coasting, like so many do. She hadn't stopped to truly absorb the beauty of her everyday life, caught up in the busyness of it all. And then there was her faith, always lingering quietly in the background, never asking much of her, and never given much in return. She had called herself spiritual, not religious, a phrase that felt safe. It let her keep her questions at bay, her doubts neatly tucked away. She prayed when she needed comfort and avoided digging deeper, worried about what she might uncover. What if the answers she found left her unsettled? What if they didn't come at all? Or worse, what if they did, and she didn't like them? These thoughts scared her, so she kept faith at a distance, something to lean on lightly, but never fully embrace. She couldn't have known then how that distance would leave her unprepared for what was coming. Life, as she knew it, was about to be shaken to its core. Suburban Illinois was like a safe little bubble for Isabella Greenfield, the kind of place where life was predictable, almost to a fault. Drama didn't go much further than a canceled soccer game or a neighbor's dog knocking over your trash bins. It was the last place anyone would expect life-altering moments to unfold. And yet, life has this way of catching you off guard, of showing up with surprises when you're least prepared. That was Isabella, an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, blissfully content in her bubble of suburban normalcy. She had no idea her world was about to be flipped on its head. What would she have done differently if she'd known? Hugged her kids a little longer, prayed more often, listened closer to those faint, persistent whispers of faith in the back of her mind? Maybe, but she didn't know, and like most of us, she carried on, moving through her days without realizing how fragile her routine really was. It all started on a day that seemed as normal as any other. Her alarm jolted her awake with its sharp, relentless beeping, always perfectly timed to interrupt the best part of her dreams. Daniel was already in the kitchen. The faint clink of his coffee mug gave him away. He was a natural morning person, the kind who found peace in the stillness of those early hours. Isabella? Not so much. Mornings were a battlefield she fought daily. Half asleep and still wrestling with her blankets, she dragged herself to the bathroom, ready to face the familiar chaos of another day. With 2 kids to wrangle, breakfast to prepare, and the ticking clock always threatening to make them late, mornings in the Greenfield house were anything but calm. But that day wasn't going to be like the others. That day was the beginning of the storm she never saw coming. Emma and Liam couldn't have been more different when it came to the morning rush. Emma, the dependable one, was always ahead of the game. By the time Isabella walked into the kitchen, Emma was already there, sitting with her cereal and nose buried in the latest book she couldn't put down. She made mornings look effortless. Liam, on the other hand, turned getting ready into a full-on negotiation. That day was no exception. Wrapped like a burrito in his blanket, he acted like he couldn't hear a word his mom said. Isabella had to pull out the big guns, a promise of extra screen time after school, just to coax him out of bed. Breakfast, pure organized chaos. Daniel, ever the helpful husband, had whipped up eggs and toast, a thoughtful gesture that always left the kitchen looking like a tornado had hit it. Meanwhile, Emma excitedly rattled on about a group project she'd been working on, while Liam couldn't stop reenacting some superhero adventure he'd watched on TV. Isabella tried to stay tuned in, but her mind was already racing through the day's agenda, a stack of papers to grade, a lunchtime parent-teacher conference, and a lesson plan on fractions that she wasn't entirely sure would keep her students from zoning out. The drive to school was as uneventful as ever, a rare moment of calm. Drop-off followed the usual script. A quick hug for Emma, who was already shooting glances at her friends, hoping her mom wouldn't embarrass her. Liam, on the other hand, was all energy, sprinting toward the playground after a playful fist bump. As Isabella drove away, she felt that familiar mix of emotions that seemed to define parenthood. Endless love, wrapped in a layer of mild exhaustion. Little did she know, this ordinary morning was about to give way to anything but an ordinary day. Isabella often marveled at how fast her kids were growing up, and some days it felt like she was just scrambling to keep pace. At work, the day followed its usual rhythm, the sharp ring of the first bell, the shuffle of students finding their seats, and the inevitable hum of chatter that took a few firm reminders to settle. She had a soft spot for her students, even when they pushed her patience to the limit. They were caught in that tricky middle school phase, not quite kids, but nowhere near teenagers. One moment they were cracking silly jokes, and the next they were dropping observations so insightful it left her wondering how she'd underestimated them. Teaching was equal parts frustration and joy, and that day, joy won out. Isabella couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for Marcus, one of her quieter students. He had been wrestling with a tough math problem all week, and when he finally nailed it, His grin made her day. It was moments like that, tiny victories in the classroom, that reminded her why she loved what she did. Lunch brought a quick parent meeting about their child's progress. Nothing out of the ordinary. Concerns about grades, questions about behavior. She offered the same reassurance she always did. Middle school was tough, but things would smooth out with time. After the meeting, she scarfed down a sandwich at her desk while chipping away at emails and fine-tuning her plans for the next day's lessons. It wasn't glamorous, but it was her routine. And in its predictability, she found a certain comfort. By the time the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Isabella felt the satisfying kind of tiredness that came from a job well done. She packed up her things, exchanged goodbyes with a few colleagues, and headed for her car. As she slid into the driver's seat, her mind was already shifting to dinner plans and the familiar chaos that awaited her at home. It had been a busy day, but a good one. And that was enough. Daniel had mentioned grilling that evening, and the thought of a quiet night at home put a smile on Isabella's face. Maybe they'd play a board game or settle in for a movie. Something simple, but perfect. As she pulled out of the school parking lot, the image of her family together made the stress of the day melt away. The drive home began like any other. Stoplights blinked through familiar intersections, and the streets she'd driven 1,000 times before unfolded in their usual rhythm. At one point, she glanced at the clock and wondered if there'd be time to swing by the store. Her mind wandered to dinner, grilled chicken, maybe paired with a salad or roasted veggies. It was such an ordinary train of thought, so routine, that it almost felt surreal in hindsight. She'd been so immersed in the everyday moments, the breakfast chaos, the tiny classroom triumphs, the predictability of her schedule. It all seemed so solid, so permanent. But life doesn't send warnings, does it? She had no way of knowing that this day, the last ordinary day she'd ever have, was about to take a devastating turn. One moment, she was humming along to the radio, debating whether to grab a fresh loaf of bread or some extra vegetables. The next, her world unraveled in an instant. There was no sign, no split-second decision to make. She didn't even see the other car. The impact was brutal, a force so sudden and violent it ripped through her reality. The sound of metal on metal screamed louder than anything she'd ever heard, like the world itself was tearing apart. Her body felt weightless, like a doll tossed around in a child's careless grip. And then there was silence, heavy and suffocating, as if time itself had paused, leaving her caught between what had been and what was yet to come. Isabella's hands clutched the steering wheel, as if holding tighter could somehow change the car's violent trajectory. But it was no use. The vehicle skidded, spinning like it had a will of its own, while the world outside became a chaotic blur. The airbags exploded with a brutal force, slamming into her chest and knocking the breath from her lungs. For a moment, everything felt unreal, like she was caught in a strange limbo, both trapped in her body and observing it from some distant place. The seconds after the crash were wrapped in an eerie silence, the kind that makes the world feel like it's paused mid-frame. Then, the pain arrived, dull and suffocating, pressing against her chest like a weight too heavy to lift. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Her head spun, her vision flickering between hazy fragments of light and shadow. Distant sounds began to creep in, the blare of car horns, the muffled rush of footsteps, but they felt far away, as though coming from a different world. Isabella fought to catch her breath, her lungs stubbornly refusing to obey. Panic took hold as her mind raced in frantic circles. Was she okay? Were there other cars involved? What about the driver who hit her? The questions came in a flood, but none of them stuck. Her thoughts were slipping, scattering like leaves in the wind. And then, everything shifted. It wasn't something she could explain, not in words, anyway. There was a moment, clear and unmistakable, where she felt herself detach. She saw her body slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling from her forehead in thin crimson lines. But it didn't feel like her anymore. The pain was gone. So was the panic. In their place was an overwhelming calm, not warm or comforting, but neutral. She wasn't scared. She wasn't anything. She simply was. In that space, time seemed to dissolve. There were no questions, no answers, no fear. Just an odd, unshakable stillness. Isabella saw the paramedics arrive, their movements swift and purposeful. Their voices carried urgency as they worked to free her from the mangled wreck. One paramedic barked instructions into a radio, while another leaned into the car, checking for a pulse. She wanted to shout, to tell them she was still there, that she could hear them, but no sound escaped. It was like she was caught in an invisible bubble, watching the scene unfold as if she were a spectator, disconnected from her body. The door was finally pried open, and they gently pulled her out. Their faces told a story of focus and worry, their hands moving with a precision born from years of training. One paramedic, a woman with kind eyes and a calm yet commanding tone, kept saying, "We're not giving up." Isabella wished she could reach out to her, let her know how much her determination meant, but she couldn't move. Time felt bizarre, both rushing past and dragging endlessly. She watched as they secured her onto a stretcher, their efforts unrelenting as they worked to stabilize her. The ambulance lights painted the wreckage in pulsing shades of red and blue, an almost surreal backdrop to the chaos. For the first time, sadness washed over her, not for herself, but for Daniel, Emma, and Liam. She pictured them at home, completely unaware of what was happening, waiting for her to walk through the door like she always did. The thought of them confused, scared, or worse, grieving, was unbearable. But then, something shifted. The harsh strobing lights began to fade, replaced by something else entirely. The new light wasn't sharp or overwhelming. It was soft, warm, and all-encompassing, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. She felt it more than saw it, a gentle, almost magnetic pull drawing her closer. Resistance wasn't even an option. The light wasn't demanding, just quietly insistent. For the first time since the crash, she felt something beyond the sadness and chaos. Peace. It wasn't terrifying. It was the opposite. Isabella felt a peace unlike anything she'd ever known. The chaos, the noise, the fear, it all dissolved, leaving only a profound sense of calm and an overwhelming feeling of love. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she wasn't alone. There was a presence, strong, comforting, and so deeply reassuring that it erased every trace of fear. It was as if every worry, every doubt, every weight she'd carried was gently being stripped away, leaving her lighter with each passing moment. Understanding didn't matter. She wasn't analyzing what was happening or why. She simply knew that it was extraordinary, something far beyond her comprehension. And it wasn't just an accident. That realization settled into her like a truth she'd always known but never fully grasped. This was the start of something far greater, something that would shift everything she thought she understood about life and what came after. The light itself was warm, gentle, and radiant, wrapping her in its glow without a trace of harshness. It wasn't blinding or overwhelming. It was welcoming, a beacon that seemed to exist not just outside her, but within her as well. She felt weightless, unburdened, as if every struggle, every fear had melted away. For the first time, she felt free, not just in her body, but in her soul. It was a freedom she hadn't known she needed. At first, the light was all she could see. It wasn't a tunnel or a pathway like she'd heard in stories. It was everywhere, wrapping around her like a gentle pull toward something greater. She couldn't see what was beyond it, but she didn't need to. Something or someone was calling to her, guiding her forward, with a presence so kind and familiar that it felt like coming home. There was no fear, no second guessing, only an instinctive trust that Isabella was exactly where she was meant to be. The light drew her in, warm and welcoming, until finally she saw him. Seeing Jesus Christ was beyond anything words could capture. He wasn't quite as she'd pictured in fleeting moments of imagination. Not exactly. Yet, he was unmistakably real, standing there with a presence that went far beyond the physical. What struck her wasn't just his form, but the way his presence radiated pure, unconditional love. It wasn't love as she'd known it before. It was deeper, limitless, and utterly accepting. It felt as though he could see every corner of her being, every fear, every failure, every doubt she'd ever carried. And yet, he loved her completely. His eyes, though, were what stayed with her. They were unlike anything she'd ever seen, filled with a compassion that seemed to stretch across eternity. They held wisdom so profound, it felt as if time itself was folded into his gaze. He didn't need to speak right away, because his words were already there, imprinted in her heart. It was communication that bypassed language altogether, reaching her soul directly. In his presence, she felt truly known, not just the good parts, but the messy, broken ones too. Yet there was no judgment, only patience. A kindness so vast it felt as though he'd been waiting for this moment forever. When he finally did speak, his voice wasn't booming or commanding. It was calm, steady, and filled with an authority that came from pure truth. "You are here for a reason," he said, and the words reverberated through every part of her being. She didn't fully grasp what he meant, but she knew this wasn't random. Whatever this was, it was purposeful, intentional, and somehow deeply tied to her existence. As he reached out, not with a touch, but with an energy that felt tangible, something within her shifted. It wasn't just emotional. It was as if her very soul was being healed and realigned. All the broken, hidden parts she didn't even realize she carried were being restored. For the first time, Isabella felt truly whole, free from pain, doubt, and the heaviness of life. It wasn't just peace. It was a completeness she had never imagined possible. Then, he showed her. It wasn't like watching a movie or even dreaming. It was immersive, like she had stepped into the heart of these visions. Isabella wasn't just seeing them, she was living them, feeling every sound, sight, and emotion as if they were her own. The first vision was of the earth, but not the familiar, vibrant world she knew. It was a planet in chaos, battered by storms that tore across cities, earthquakes that swallowed whole landscapes, and floods that consumed everything in their path. The destruction was overwhelming. Buildings crumbled into dust, forests burned like torches, and the cries of terrified people filled the air. She felt their despair and helplessness as the world around them unraveled. The fear pressed against her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. But even that devastation was only the beginning. The next vision cut deeper. She saw a man, a figure who radiated light and promise at first glance. His charisma was magnetic, his presence commanding in a way that made people gravitate to him, clinging to every word. He spoke of peace, unity, and solutions to the chaos consuming the world. People followed him with a desperation that bordered on worship, drawn to his promises of hope and restoration. But there was something beneath the surface, something Isabella couldn't ignore. The light around him wasn't pure, it was deceptive. His words, though soothing and sweet, carried an undercurrent of something poisonous. She knew without being told. This was the Antichrist. The realization settled over her like a cold shadow, undeniable and terrifying. He wasn't what he seemed. He wasn't here to save. He was here to deceive. Isabella watched as his charm became a weapon, manipulating people into submission. He wielded technology in ways that felt miraculous, but they carried a sinister purpose. There was a global currency system painted as a solution for equality, but it bound people in chains of dependence and control. Technology advanced under his rule, but it wasn't freedom. It was surveillance. Artificial intelligence monitored every action, every thought, leaving no room for privacy, dissent, or rebellion. The world he promised was enslavement wrapped in the guise of progress. The man's deception ran deeper than words. He performed acts that seemed miraculous, feeding the belief that he was divine. Crowds worshipped him, their devotion blinding them to the darkness lurking beneath his facade. The world was split, those who followed him and those who resisted his rule. For those who refused to bow to his system, life became unbearable. They were labeled enemies of peace, hunted down, persecuted, and shunned. Families were torn apart, communities were dismantled, and the faithful, those who clung to Christ, became targets of relentless oppression. The world he built looked unified at first glance, but beneath the surface, it was a machine of fear and manipulation, fueled by lies and controlled by ironclad systems. Isabella turned to Jesus, overwhelmed by what she was witnessing. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, though even as the words left her, they felt small compared to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. His response was calm but resolute. "You must understand the times that are coming. You must prepare your heart and help others to do the same. Many will be deceived, but those who remain faithful to me will find hope, even in the darkest of days." Then he showed her a glimpse of that hope. Small clusters of believers scattered across the world, standing firm in their faith despite the dangers they faced. They were hidden, resisting the man's rule, but their light shone brighter than the darkness around them. These were the faithful. They didn't rely on the systems of the world, the promises of technology, or the comforts of false unity. They relied solely on Jesus. Isabella could see their courage, their strength, and the way they leaned on one another, bound together by an unshakable faith. They were the light in a world consumed by shadow, a living testament to the power of hope and trust in God. She didn't want to leave his presence. Being with Jesus felt like coming home, as though every question she'd ever had was answered, not in words, but in a completeness beyond explanation. But then he told her something she didn't expect. "You must go back." She didn't want to. The longing to stay was overwhelming, but in her heart, she understood. There was a purpose for her, a reason he had shown her these things. As the light began to fade, a deep ache of longing filled her, but so did a renewed determination. Isabella didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but one truth stood clear. She had been called to something greater. From the moment Isabella opened her eyes again, she knew her life could never return to what it had been. The visions Jesus had shown her were more than just fleeting images or distant dreams. They were living experiences, as vivid as reality itself. She hadn't merely watched them, she had felt them. Each scene was so raw, so immersive, it was like stepping into a distorted reflection of the world she once knew. The earth, as she saw it, was unrecognizable. It was as though creation itself was in rebellion, its very foundations splitting apart. Earthquakes ravaged cities, turning once mighty skyscrapers into mountains of rubble in mere seconds. Floodwaters roared through neighborhoods, sweeping away cars, trees, and homes in an unstoppable torrent. Fires blazed across the land, consuming entire forests until nothing remained but barren, smoldering wastelands. And the sounds, the cries of humanity, cut through the destruction like a knife. Fear, confusion, and anguish echoed everywhere, a collective desperation that seemed to pulse through every broken corner of existence. But the chaos wasn't limited to nature. Society itself was crumbling under the weight of collapse. Economies fell apart overnight, leaving entire nations in panic. People scrambled for survival, lining up outside the few stores that remained operational. Armed guards stood watch, rationing what little food and water was left. The faces in those lines haunted her. Parents clutching their children with trembling hands. Elderly couples, their eyes heavy with defeat, huddled together for warmth and reassurance. Young men and women stared blankly into the distance, as if the weight of their shattered futures had robbed them of hope. The fear in their eyes wasn't just palpable, it was suffocating. And then, amidst it all, the Antichrist had appeared. At first, his presence seemed like a balm to the chaos. He stood out, a figure who radiated light and promise. He spoke words of peace and unity, offering solutions to the world's unraveling problems. People clung to his every word, their desperation drawing them to him like moths to a flame. But Isabella could see the truth beneath his charm. She could feel it. This was no savior. This was the Antichrist. His promises were hollow, his light a counterfeit. Behind his honeyed words was a darkness so deep and insidious it chilled her to the core. And yet, the world embraced him, unaware of the darkness they were welcoming. Isabella's heart ached for them, for the ones who couldn't see the truth, until it was too late. The weight of the vision stayed with her, and she knew it wasn't something she could ever forget or ignore. At first, the man was everything the world seemed to need. He had a charisma that captivated everyone who listened, his voice a soothing balm to the fear and uncertainty that gripped humanity. His promises were grand, solutions to restore peace and stability, to bring the world back from the brink of chaos. People clung to his words like a lifeline. They flocked to him in droves, desperate for the security he claimed to offer. He painted a vision of unity, a world without borders, where nations would work as one to ensure prosperity for all. His rhetoric was magnetic, his promises seductive, and the world was eager to believe. Isabella watched as governments bent to his will, aligning themselves with his vision and declaring him a savior, a leader unlike any other in history. People hailed him as a beacon of hope, convinced he had the power to rebuild what they had lost. But beneath the surface of his charm and promises, Isabella could sense the truth. What made him so dangerous wasn't just his words, but the tools he wielded. Tools that gave him an almost supernatural power over the world. One of his most potent weapons was technology, which he used to tighten his control over humanity. A global currency system became his centerpiece. At first, it appeared to be the answer to the world's crumbling economies. Cash was obsolete. Everything was digital. Transactions were seamless and efficient, and people marveled at the ease of it all. But this wasn't liberation. It was a trap. The system was entirely under his control. Anyone who resisted him, who refused to align with his vision, was locked out. Without access to the digital currency, people couldn't buy food, couldn't pay for shelter, couldn't survive. It was more than a financial system. It was a tool of oppression, forcing humanity into submission. And it didn't stop there. He turned advanced artificial intelligence and surveillance technology into his enforcers. Cameras, sensors, and monitoring devices were everywhere, watching every movement, analyzing every decision. No corner of life was private anymore. The system wasn't just efficient, it was totalitarian. It left no room for dissent or rebellion, creating a world where freedom was an illusion and control was absolute. Isabella saw the full weight of his power, and it terrified her. What unsettled her most wasn't just the systems he built. It was how willingly the world embraced them, blind to the cost of their submission. In the world shaped by the Antichrist, privacy became a relic of the past. No action, no word, no thought seemed safe from the all-seeing eye of his technological empire. Advanced surveillance systems flagged anyone who questioned him, marking them as dissenters. These people were swiftly isolated, punished, and erased from the illusion of harmony he worked so hard to create. The technology was extraordinary, so advanced it felt like magic. But its purpose was anything but miraculous. It was a weapon, finely tuned to erode freedom and crush the will of those who dared to resist. And then, there were the miracles. Isabella saw him heal the sick, produce food from seemingly nowhere, and even manipulate the weather. The crowds were in awe, bowing before him and declaring him divine. Yet even amidst their worship, Isabella could see the truth. These were no miracles of God. They were deceptions, powerful, carefully orchestrated tricks designed to blur the line between truth and lies. For many, the distinction became impossible to see. They fell into his snare, unable to resist the allure of his false promises and seeming power. The world he built appeared perfect on the surface. Nations were united, peace seemed to reign, and prosperity was promised to all. But it was all a carefully constructed illusion. Beneath the shiny veneer lay fear, control, and a relentless web of deception. Those who refused to follow him, who wouldn't take his mark or align themselves with his rule, were branded as enemies of progress. Families were torn apart as loved ones made different choices, some embracing the Antichrist, others holding fast to their faith in Jesus. Believers became targets. They were hunted, imprisoned, silenced, and in many cases, killed for refusing to bow. Their communities were infiltrated, their secret gatherings discovered and disrupted. Yet, even in this suffocating darkness, Isabella saw light. Jesus revealed to her the faithful, small groups of believers who refused to give in. They lived in hiding, scattered across remote corners of the earth, but their faith burned bright. They clung to God's promises, praying together, lifting one another up, and refusing to accept the Antichrist's mark or his rule. Though battered and weary, their resolve was unshakable. These were the lights in the darkness, proof that even in the bleakest times, hope could not be extinguished. They weren't just surviving, they were standing firm, a proof of the power of faith and the enduring strength of God's people. The faithful didn't lean on the systems of the world for their strength. Their foundation was in Jesus alone, and their courage was nothing short of extraordinary. They faced persecution, hunger, isolation, and even death. But they never wavered. Their hope wasn't tied to the fleeting promises of this life, but to the eternal life that Jesus had promised. Isabella watched as their faith shone like a beacon in the suffocating darkness, unshakable even as the world crumbled around them. Numbers didn't matter. Their belief was powerful, their resolve unyielding. They didn't fight with swords or rage. They fought with love, with unceasing prayer, and with the truth of God's word. As the visions continued, a deep sense of urgency gripped Isabella's heart. Jesus wasn't just showing her these things to observe. He was preparing her to act. His voice resonated within her, calm but commanding. The deception will be great, but my truth is greater. Many will be led astray, but those who seek me will find me. Stand firm and do not be afraid. When the visions began to fade, Isabella felt a flood of emotions. The sheer weight of what she had witnessed was overwhelming, yet within it there was a glimmer of unshakable hope. She had seen the power of faith, the resilience of those who clung to Jesus even when the world turned against them. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The trials would be immense, the deception pervasive, but one truth stood firm. Jesus would never abandon those who trusted in him. As she stood in his presence, the enormity of her calling pressed heavily on her heart. The visions weren't meant for her alone. They were meant to be shared, a message to prepare others, not only for the trials to come, but for the hope and ultimate victory that would be found in him. Jesus' gaze met hers, steady and full of love. His presence calmed the storm of emotions within her. grounding her. She understood then that he wasn't showing her these things to frighten her, but to equip her. This was her calling, a purpose she could no longer ignore. Though the weight of what she had seen would remain with her, so too would the strength she drew from his presence. Isabella knew now, with unwavering certainty, that she had a mission: to be a witness, to stand firm, and to prepare others for what lay ahead. As Jesus spoke again, his words carried both the weight of authority and the tenderness of love. What you have seen is the beginning of what must come. The enemy will seek to deceive, to destroy, and to lead many astray. But I have overcome the world, and those who remain in me will not be lost. Isabella clung to his words as if they were a lifeline, letting each one root itself deeply in her heart. They were more than just promises. They were a beacon cutting through the darkness of what she had seen. His love surrounded her, vast and unshakable, infusing her with the courage she needed to listen to what he said next. You must prepare your heart and help others to do the same, Jesus continued, his voice steady but laced with urgency. The times ahead will be difficult. Many will be deceived by the promises of the enemy, but those who know me, who seek me, will recognize the truth. They will not be led astray. The visions she'd seen came rushing back to her. The Antichrist charisma, the seemingly miraculous technologies, the illusion of unity and peace that veiled an oppressive, controlling system. It was clearer now than ever how easy it would be for people to fall into his trap. The world, desperate for stability, would grasp at the false promises of peace and prosperity without seeing the cost. The deception would be powerful, almost irresistible. And yet, Jesus was showing her that there was a way to stand firm, a way to see through the lies. Her voice trembled as she asked him, "How will they know? How will people recognize the truth when everything seems so convincing?" Jesus smiled, a small, gentle smile that felt like it was meant just for her. It was a smile that calmed the storm inside her, wrapping her in a peace that only he could provide. "They will know if they know me," he said. "The truth is not hidden from those who seek it. My sheep hear my voice, and they follow me. The enemy's lies cannot stand against my word. Teach them to remain in me, to trust me above all else." His words were simple, yet they carried a depth and weight that left Isabella in awe. The path to truth was clear, but it required intentionality, faith, and a connection to him. As his words settled into her soul, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. It was no longer a question of what she had seen, but of what she would do with it. The world needed to know, and she had been entrusted with the message. It wasn't about having all the answers or predicting every twist of what was to come. It was about relationships, knowing Jesus so intimately that his truth would always shine brighter than the darkest deception. Isabella realized then that this wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation to draw closer to him, to cultivate a faith so deeply rooted that no storm could shake it. As he continued, Jesus shared specific signs that would signal the unfolding of the events she had seen. He spoke of technological advances, tools initially designed to improve life, but ultimately twisted into mechanisms of control. "These things will come," he said, his voice steady, "but do not be afraid. They are signs, not the end. They are meant to awaken, not to destroy." Isabella's thoughts returned to the small groups of believers she had seen in the visions, those who resisted the Antichrist and clung to their faith. "How will they survive?" she asked, her voice tinged with both concern and awe. "How will they stand when everything is against them?" "They will not stand alone," Jesus replied, his words filled with assurance. "I will be with them. My Spirit will guide them, strengthen them, and sustain them. They will find each other, drawn together by their faith. and they will become my light in the darkness. They may be few, but their faith will move mountains. The vision of those small communities returned to her mind. Ordinary people huddled together in prayer, hidden yet united by their trust in Jesus. They weren't warriors or leaders by the world's standards, but their faith gave them a strength greater than any weapon. They had little in terms of resources, but what they had was more than enough, because they had Him. Their trust in Jesus brought them a peace that the chaos of the world could never touch. Then Jesus' voice turned urgent, His message clear and unwavering. "Tell them," He said. "Tell them to prepare, not in fear, but in faith. Tell them to build their lives on me, to know my word and my voice. Tell them to seek me now, while there is still time, so they will not be shaken when the storms come." Tears streamed down Isabella's face as she nodded. The weight of His words pressed upon her heart, not as a burden, but as a calling. This was her mission, to carry His message, to be His voice, and to help others anchor themselves in Him before it was too late. Her purpose was undeniable, and though the responsibility felt immense, His love and strength filled her with the courage to accept it. The weight of the calling was overwhelming, but in a strange way, it was also freeing. Isabella didn't have to do this alone. Just as He promised to be with those who heard and believed, He promised to walk with her every step of the way. As the warmth and radiance of His presence began to fade, she felt herself being gently pulled back. The light around them changed, softening, and she realized she was returning to the world she'd left behind. A pang of longing pierced her heart. She didn't want to leave. She wanted to remain with Him forever. But His voice, filled with infinite love, reassured her. "You must go back," He said. "But remember, I am always with you. I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you." Even as the light dimmed and the pull toward her body grew stronger, His final words remained clear and steady in her heart. "Be strong and courageous. The days ahead will be difficult, but my grace is sufficient. Trust in me, and you will not fall." The transition felt like waking from the deepest sleep, but instead of feeling rested, Isabella was overcome by a heavy ache, both physical and emotional. The clarity of His presence lingered, but so did the weight of what she had experienced. She knew her life could never return to what it was before. At first, everything was a haze. Her mind struggled to process the enormity of what she had just seen, as though she had been lifted to the vastness of eternity, and then dropped back into a world that felt small, fragile, and confining. A rhythmic beeping broke through the fog in her mind. It was steady, almost comforting in its predictability. Then came the voices, muffled at first, but gradually sharpening. Someone was calling her name, their tone laced with relief and disbelief. Her eyes fluttered open, met by the harsh, sterile lights of a hospital room. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and metal. Machines surrounded her, the steady hum and soft beeping of monitors a constant background. Wires and tubes connected her body to various devices. Her arms felt heavy with IVs, but she was alive. A nurse leaned over her, her face a mixture of shock and amazement. "Isabella," she said, her voice trembling. "You're awake." Relief and awe radiated from the nurse's expression, but Isabella was still grappling with the weight of what had just happened. She wasn't the same. She couldn't be. Her return to the world wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning. The nurse's words broke the stillness of the room. "You're awake." Her voice was soft, but it carried a mix of disbelief and relief, as though she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. For Isabella, the words sounded distant, muffled, as though they were spoken underwater. Awake? Of course she was awake. But then the memories came flooding back. The crash, the jarring impact, the chaos of metal crumpling, and the surreal moment she saw her own body being pulled from the wreckage. Her chest tightened as panic bubbled up. Was it real? Had she truly seen Jesus? Or had it all been some elaborate dream, a hallucination her mind created to shield her from the trauma? She barely had time to untangle her thoughts before Daniel rushed into the room. His face was pale, his eyes swollen and red from hours of crying. He moved quickly, grabbing her hand as though afraid she might disappear. "Isabella," he said, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his face. "You're okay. You're alive." That word, alive, landed like a tidal wave. She was alive. Against all odds, she had survived. Daniel's relief poured out of him. He kissed her hand over and over, whispering between sobs, "Thank you, God. Thank you." His gratitude was raw and unfiltered, almost too much for Isabella to process in that moment. She wanted to respond, to let him know she was still there, but her voice refused to cooperate. A weak croak was all she could manage, her throat raw and burning. Every inch of her body ached, but she found the strength to squeeze his hand, a small but certain gesture that said, "I'm still here." The door opened again, and a group of doctors entered, led by a tall man with streaks of gray in his hair. His expression was professional, but there was something in his eyes, a mix of awe and curiosity. He introduced himself as Dr. Patel and stepped closer, flipping through a clipboard. "You suffered severe injuries in the accident," he began, his tone calm but serious. "Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and significant trauma to your head and chest." Dr. Patel paused, lowering the clipboard slightly as he looked directly at Isabella. "When you arrived, we weren't sure if you'd survive." There was a weight in his voice, and then, after a brief silence, he added softly, "Frankly, it's a miracle you're alive." That word, miracle, hung in the air. Daniel's grip on her hand tightened, his tears starting anew. "It really is," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For Isabella, the word meant more than just survival. It was confirmation of everything she already knew deep in her heart. This wasn't a random second chance. It wasn't luck. She hadn't just survived. She had been brought back for a reason. Her body ached, her mind was spinning, and the sterile hospital lights were harsh against her eyes. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the truth she carried now, the certainty that she had been spared not just to live, but to fulfill a purpose far greater than herself. The doctor's voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. "We've seen recoveries before, but this is extraordinary. Your heart stopped twice during surgery. We had to revive you, and yet here you are, awake, stable." He glanced down at his clipboard, as though even he was struggling to make sense of it. "It's nothing short of remarkable." The word again hung there. Remarkable. A miracle. Isabella had heard that word countless times in her life, but never had it felt so tangible, so real as it did now. She turned her gaze toward Daniel, who sat beside her bed, nodding along as the doctor spoke. His lips were pressed tightly together, as if he were holding back a flood of emotions. She noticed the way his hands fidgeted slightly, clasped tightly together in his lap. Across the room, the nurse adjusted one of the machines, the cross around her neck catching the light for a brief moment. Isabella wanted to speak, to tell them about what she had seen, about Jesus, the light, the visions. But the words refused to form, as though her spirit was telling her it wasn't the right time. The days that followed blurred together into a steady rhythm of recovery. Physical therapy pushed her weakened body to its limits. Tests came back with cautious optimism, and doctors repeated the same warnings. Take things slowly. Don't overdo it. Her body was battered, fragile, but her spirit felt unshakable. Each quiet moment in that hospital bed was spent replaying what she had experienced. The radiant light, the undeniable presence of Jesus, and the vivid visions of what was to come. It all felt so clear, so purposeful, She couldn't ignore the feeling that this wasn't just a second chance at life. It was a call to action, a mission. She wasn't meant to simply recover. She was meant to do something. Daniel stayed by her side through every painful moment. He slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his head leaning awkwardly against the wall. He held her hand during physical therapy, whispering encouragement when the pain brought tears to her eyes. Most importantly, he listened. When Isabella finally found the strength to speak about what had happened, she was hesitant at first. How could she describe something so extraordinary, so far beyond the normal scope of life? Would he think she was imagining things? But when she spoke, tentatively at first, then with growing conviction, about the light, about Jesus, and the visions, Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss her. Instead, he listened with wide, wondering eyes, his grip tightening on her hand as she recounted every detail. When she finished, he didn't hesitate. "I believe you," he said softly. His words were like a balm to her soul, melting away the fear she had carried since the moment she opened her eyes in the hospital. His faith in her experience gave her the courage to start sharing her story with others. She began with close friends and family, and eventually with the hospital staff, who had been quietly curious about her recovery. Not everyone reacted the same way. Some nodded politely, their expressions kind but skeptical, clearly trying to process what she was saying. Others looked at her with awe, as if struggling to reconcile the woman before them with the incredible story she was telling. But no matter their reactions, Isabella knew one thing for certain: she couldn't keep this to herself. Some people outright dismissed Isabella's story. They chalked it up to a near-death hallucination or the effects of medication, brushing it aside as something explainable, even ordinary. But no matter how they reacted, Isabella knew the truth. What she had experienced was real. Jesus was real. The visions were real. And the warnings he had given her weren't just meant for her, they were for everyone. The world needed to hear what was coming, and more importantly, how to prepare for it. When the doctors finally discharged her, they called her recovery nothing short of miraculous. Some credited her willpower, her determination to live. But Isabella knew better. It wasn't her strength that had brought her back. It was his. As she stepped out of the hospital for the first time in weeks, Daniel steadying her arm as the sunlight kissed her face. An overwhelming wave of gratitude washed over her. She felt alive. After all, she had a purpose now. She glanced at Daniel, his expression a mix of relief and quiet awe, and knew she wasn't alone in this. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges might come, she would face them with him by her side. Jesus had shown her the way, and now her mission was to follow it, no matter where it led. Coming home felt surreal, like stepping back into a life that wasn't entirely hers anymore. Everything looked the same. The kitchen with its chipped countertops, the family photos hanging slightly askew on the walls, the living room where she and Daniel had spent countless nights watching movies with the kids. Yet, everything felt different. Or maybe she was different. The life she had returned to wasn't just hers to live. It was hers to use. Her home, her family, her everyday routines. They were now pieces of a larger picture, part of a calling that had been etched into her heart. As she crossed the threshold of her home, Isabella took a deep breath. The warmth of her familiar surroundings mixed with the weight of her newfound purpose. And for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to live for something greater than herself. Coming home changed everything for Isabella. The moment she stepped through the door, the familiar sights and sounds of her house clashed with the weight of what she had experienced. She couldn't look at the world the same way anymore, not after everything she had seen and felt. Emma was the first to reach her, wrapping her arms around her mom with a gentle but heartfelt hug. Her eyes brimmed with relief, and for a second, Isabella could feel the depth of her daughter's worry. Then, there was Liam, bounding toward her like a rocket, completely oblivious to the fragility of her injuries. He threw himself at her with all the energy of a 6-year-old, and though the pain shot through her body, Isabella held them both tightly, tears spilling from her eyes. For that brief moment, she was just mom. No visions, no weighty responsibilities. Just a mother grateful to be alive and home with her children. But the moment passed, and as the kids scurried off, the reality of what she had seen settled back in like a shadow that never left her side. Even as she tried to settle into a routine of rest and recovery, the memories haunted her. The faces of people deceived by the Antichrist, the small scattered groups of believers standing firm in their faith, the destruction and chaos that rippled through every corner of the earth. It was all seared into her mind. She couldn't forget it, and deep down, she knew she wasn't meant to. Jesus had shown her these things for a purpose. Now that she was home, the question loomed larger than ever. What do I do with it? She began cautiously, sharing her experience with those closest to her. Daniel had already heard the story in the hospital, and his unwavering support became a pillar of strength for her. But when she started opening up to friends and extended family, the reactions were complicated. "You've been through so much," one person said, their tone gentle but patronizing. "It's probably just your brain trying to process the trauma." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. How could she explain something so deeply spiritual, so vivid and real, only to have it brushed off as a side effect of medication or a stress response? But then she remembered the look in Jesus' eyes when he told her to share what she had seen. He hadn't promised it would be easy. He hadn't said people would always believe her. He had simply told her to do it. So she kept trying. Even when it was awkward, even when people doubted her or outright dismissed her, she shared her story. Isabella wasn't telling her story to convince anyone. She wasn't there to argue or prove a point. She was sharing it because she had to. The truth of what she had experienced was too important to keep buried, no matter how hard it was to put into words. As the weeks passed, Isabella began to see the world through a new lens. Headlines about advancements in artificial intelligence and surveillance technology took on a deeper meaning, reminding her of the systems the Antichrist would one day use to control humanity. Discussions of global economic instability sounded eerily similar to the unified currency system she had seen in her visions. Even the cultural shifts, the growing polarization, the erosion of truth, seemed to echo the warnings Jesus had given her. The changes weren't dramatic or immediate, but they were there, subtle and steady, for anyone who was paying attention. She couldn't ignore it. The world was shifting, moving step by step toward the events Jesus had shown her. The sense of urgency weighed heavily on her. She felt a deep responsibility to help others see what she was seeing, to help them prepare not just for the physical changes that were coming, but for the spiritual challenges that would test their faith. But where was she supposed to start? She wasn't a preacher or a theologian. She was just Isabella, a middle school teacher, a wife, a mom. The enormity of her calling made her question whether she was capable of making any real difference. In her doubt, she turned to the only place she knew could offer clarity: prayer. Hour after hour, she poured her heart out to Jesus, asking for guidance, for wisdom, for the courage to take the next step. And over time, an answer began to emerge. She didn't need to have all the answers or a perfectly mapped out plan. She just needed to take the first step. For Isabella, that step was sharing her story with her church. It wasn't an easy decision. Standing in front of her congregation and laying bare her experience felt terrifying. She feared being judged, misunderstood, or dismissed entirely. But she also knew she couldn't let fear silence her. When the day came, her hands trembled as she stood at the front of the church. Her voice wavered as she began to speak, recounting her accident, her encounter with Jesus, and the visions she had been shown. She shared the warnings, the urgency she felt, and her deep conviction that people needed to prepare, not just physically, but spiritually. As she spoke, a calmness settled over her. The words seemed to flow effortlessly, as if they weren't entirely her own. By the time she finished, tears filled her eyes, and the eyes of many in the audience. After the service, people came up to her, some thanking her for sharing, others asking questions about how they could prepare for the times ahead. A few even shared their own experiences, stories of spiritual encounters, or feelings of urgency to draw closer to God. It was humbling and deeply encouraging. For the first time, Isabella realized she wasn't alone in this journey. There were others who felt the same stirring, the same call to action. At home, her life began to shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her prayers became more frequent, more intimate. The Bible, which she had often read out of obligation or routine, suddenly came alive to her. Passages she had skimmed over in the past now seemed to leap off the page, resonating with an urgency and relevance she hadn't felt before. Her faith wasn't just personal anymore. It was something she actively wanted to pass on to her children. She started teaching Emma and Liam what it meant to trust in Jesus, not just through words, but through action. Family devotionals became a new tradition, an intentional time for them to gather, pray, and talk about God. She watched as her kids began to grow in their own faith. Emma's natural thoughtfulness turned towards spiritual questions, while Liam's boundless energy transformed into an excitement for stories about Jesus. Even Daniel was changing. He had always supported Isabella's faith, but it had been more out of love for her than a deep conviction of his own. Now, though, she saw something stirring in him. They started praying together, something they hadn't done since their wedding day. The simple act of holding hands and lifting their voices together brought a closeness she hadn't realized they were missing. It was as though their faith was becoming a shared journey, one that strengthened their bond as husband and wife. Still, despite the positive changes within her family, Isabella couldn't shake the sense of urgency that followed her like a shadow. The world around her seemed to inch closer to the events she had seen in her visions, and she felt an unshakable responsibility to prepare others. She didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was clear. There was no going back to the way things were. Jesus had shown her the truth. Now it was her mission to live it, to share it, and to help others prepare for what was to come. Each night, as she lay in bed, she would reflect on the day's events, praying for guidance and strength. A strange but comforting blend of peace and purpose settled over her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew that much. But she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Jesus had promised to be with Isabella, and she felt his presence every step of the way. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wasn't facing them alone. Her confidence didn't come from her own strength. It came from his. One evening, as the house settled into its usual nighttime quiet, Isabella sat at the kitchen table, her Bible open in front of her. The occasional creak of floorboards echoed softly as Emma and Liam moved in their rooms. Daniel sat across from her, his face a mix of warmth and concern as he watched her. "You've been so quiet," he said, reaching out to place his hand over hers. "What's on your mind?" Isabella hesitated, searching for the right words. Finally, she looked up, her voice steady, but tinged with uncertainty. "I feel like I need to do more," she said. "I've shared my story with some people, but it's not enough. There's so much more to say, so much more to prepare for. I feel like I'm carrying this message, this burden, and I don't know how to get it out there." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady as he listened. "You've already done so much," he said, his voice calm but encouraging. "But if you feel like there's more, then maybe it's time to take a leap of faith." His words settled over her, lingering long after they'd gone to bed. a leap of faith. That was exactly what it felt like, stepping into the unknown, trusting that God would guide her even when she couldn't see the way forward. It was daunting, but as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she felt a quiet determination rising within her. That night, Isabella poured her heart out in prayer, her whispers blending with the stillness around her. "Show me what to do," she asked Jesus. "Use me however you need to. Just help me be faithful." The next morning, she woke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't need to know all the answers right away. She just needed to take the next step. For her, that step was sharing her story on a larger scale. She sat at her kitchen table and began writing it all down. Every detail, every vision, every word Jesus had spoken to her. It wasn't easy. Reliving the accident, the visions of destruction, and the moments of doubt felt like reopening wounds. But with every word she wrote, Isabella felt Jesus' presence. When she finished, she shared her writing with a few close friends and family members. Their responses varied. Some were moved to tears, others inspired to examine and deepen their own faith. One friend, a pastor, was particularly encouraging. "People need to hear this," he told her, "now more than ever." His words stayed with her, sparking the courage she needed to take the next leap. Isabella decided to start speaking publicly, beginning with local churches and community groups. The first time she stood in front of a crowd, her hands trembled and her pulse raced. The thought of being dismissed or judged made her stomach churn. But as she began to speak, something incredible happened. The fear melted away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose. Isabella was delivering a message of hope, of warning, of faith. She told them about the light, the overwhelming presence of Jesus, and the visions he had shown her. She described the rise of the Antichrist, the deception that would lure so many, and the small yet powerful communities of believers who would stand firm in their faith. She didn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead, but she didn't leave people without hope either. "The enemy's power is great," she said, her voice steady, "but God's power is greater. Those who stay faithful, who build their lives on Jesus, will not be overcome." As she spoke, she saw the impact of her words. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes wide, with a mixture of fear, conviction, and determination. Afterward, many came up to her, asking questions about how they could prepare, how they could strengthen their faith in the face of what was to come. Others simply thanked her, their faces reflecting a quiet resolve, as if they had been awakened to a truth they could no longer ignore. That night, as Isabella reflected on the experience, she felt a deep sense of peace. She was walking the path Jesus had set before her, step by step. The journey wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And she wasn't walking it alone. Isabella could see the seeds being planted, the words she spoke, the stories she shared. They were starting to take root in people's hearts. But she knew it wasn't just about the speeches or the public moments. The real work was also in the quiet, everyday acts of faith that often went unnoticed. At home, her focus was on her kids. She spent more time teaching Emma and Liam about the importance of knowing Jesus personally. They read the Bible together, prayed as a family, and talked openly about the world and what it meant to follow Christ. Isabella encouraged her children to ask questions, to wrestle with their faith rather than just accept it at face value. She wanted them to seek the truth for themselves, to build a faith that was strong enough to stand on its own. As she guided her children, she started noticing changes in herself. Her faith deepened in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her trust in Jesus became unshakable, a constant foundation in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. She found strength in prayer, comfort in Scripture, and a sense of direction that carried her even on the hardest days. Isabella also began letting go of the fear of what others thought of her, the doubt, the skepticism, the outright dismissals. None of it mattered as much anymore. Her focus was on being faithful to God's calling, not on pleasing people. That didn't mean the journey was easy. There were moments of doubt, times when the enormity of what she had been called to do threatened to overwhelm her. But in those moments, she would return to the promise Jesus had given her. I will never leave you, and I will never forsake you. Are you ready to build your faith and strengthen your relationship with Jesus, no matter what the future holds? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button for more.